In a small, tight-knit community, there was a man named Greg. He was a well-respected businessman, always boasting about how much he cared for his workers and community. Everyone knew him as the guy who would lend a hand to anyone in need. Greg's word was considered gold, and if he said he'd help, you could trust him. At least, that's what everyone thought. One winter, a massive snowstorm hit, and the town was left stranded. Power lines were down, homes were cold, and people were struggling to survive. The local grocery store ran out of supplies, and families were getting desperate. Greg, knowing the severity of the situation, promised the town that he'd provide food, water, and blankets to anyone who needed it, all free of charge. He even gathered volunteers and set up a donation drive to ensure no one was left behind. For days, Greg worked tirelessly, organizing everything and assuring the town that help was on the way. People felt relief, knowing they could count on him in such a difficult time. But as the days passed, something seemed off. The food deliveries Greg promised never came. The blankets he said he'd arranged for families were nowhere to be found. The volunteers he'd promised were mysteriously unavailable. Days turned into weeks, and still, no help came. Families were forced to rely on each other, scraping by with what little they had left. The frustration and anger began to rise as people realized they had been duped. Greg, who had made so many promises, was nowhere to be found. He stopped returning calls and avoided the community's pleas for help. Finally, one of Greg's employees, a woman named Sarah, had had enough. She blew the whistle, revealing that Greg had actually taken all the supplies meant for the town and sold them on the black market, pocketing the profits while people were left in the cold. The town, once full of trust and respect for Greg, now seethed with anger. They had been betrayed by the very person who claimed to be their savior. The man who promised to help them had turned his back on them when they needed him the most. All for personal gain. And the worst part? Greg had never been held accountable. He walked away scot-free, as if the damage he had caused didn't matter. And the town? They were left broken, not just by the storm, but by the betrayal that cut deeper than anything else. This story plays on the betrayal of trust, especially when it involves people in power taking advantage of those who rely on them. It's the kind of story that could stir up a lot of frustration and anger, particularly toward those who exploit others for personal gain.